Erin, are you there? Or Jess, someone?
This is Aaron speaking.
Hey, Erin. Well, maybe you should talk to Jess or anyway, if they can hear me. During the meeting, the interpreters prefer not to be asked to introduce themselves, not that that was a plan, but that way we can just concentrate on our role as an interpreter and not speak during the meeting.
That's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, see you soon.
Okay, hi everybody. L'chaim, l'chaksan, Sky the Infinite, Nikanim. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sky the Infinite, and that was my introduction in Chinekwawa. I'm the Native Nations Club coordinator. I'm also an intertribal descendant of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde on my mother's side, Lakota from Rosebud on my father's side, as well as the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico. I'm in my matriarchal lineage, and the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma on my father's side, among others. Okay, I would just like to thank and name the planning committee that put so much time and effort into making this event happen. This includes PCC Southeast Native Nations Club, PCC Southeast Women's Resource Center, PCC Southeast Multicultural Center, PCC Campus Outreach and Advocacy Project, and PCC Native Studies faculty, Dr. Blake Hausman, shout out, woo woo. PCC Native Nations Club is a cultural meetup welcoming all Indigenous students to join us in discussions, skill shares, and other activities on Mondays from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. with special events on the third Friday of each month. We work to create an environment of inclusivity and upliftment while bridging the gap between students and staff. Native Nations Club also offers opportunities for gifts and resources for all our members. In addition to the planning committee, this event was made possible by generous financial support from the PCC Campus Outreach and Advocacy Project and the Portland State University Center for Women's Leadership. We will put links to their programs in the chat. Please check them out. We appreciate their support for this event greatly. Now it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Lahui Whitebear. She uses she, her pronouns and is an enrolled member of the coastal band of the Chumash Nation. Lahui received her PhD student from the Women, Gender, and Sexuality program at Oregon State University. She is the Assistant Director of the OSU Native American Longhouse in a House. Luhui is a mother, poet, and Indigenous activist. Her research focuses on Indigenous rhetorics, indigeneity, and reclaiming of Indigenous identity, gender roles, missing and murdered Indigenous women, Indigenous resistance movements, and natural resource protection. Her most recent projects include the incorporation of heteropatriarchy in Native traditions, as well as intergenerational Indigenous activism with the Dakota Access Pipeline resistance movement. And with that, thank you so much for joining us and for leading this discussion, Dr. Luhui Whitebear.
Haku, everyone. It's great to be here with you all today for this really important conversation. I'm always humbled to be asked to be part of these conversations and thinking about the ways that we continue to advocate for change. And over the past years, we've seen some positive growth and know that we still have a whole lot more to go. I did want to also mention that I'm Coastal Chumash and also have Huastec and Cochimi ancestry as well. And I carry my ancestors with me in all that I do. And for a tech update, we did want to let you know that this session is being recorded, and to please use the Q&A function down on the bottom. You can see that little button where it says Q&A. The panelists, we will be seeing those questions that are submitted through that function, and the chat will remain open, but we're not going to be tracking that as panelists and moderators. And so please put your questions for us in the Q&A function. And there's a ASL interpretation and transcription that are also available. So thank you to our interpreters as well. And with that, we wanted to bring in our speakers. We have Dr. Kelly Gonzalez and Abigail Echohawk that are joining us today. I'm honored to be virtually sitting with you all from Kalapuya land to the lands that you all are sitting on. And before we got started, it would be great if we can have you all introduce yourselves and how you want to be introduced, and talk a little bit about your work. And we'll start collecting questions, and I'll ask some questions too after you all introduce yourselves. So I don't know which one of y'all would like to go first.
I'm happy to go first. Hi, good morning or good afternoon. It's great to be here. And Luhui, nice to see you again. And Abigail, good to see you again as well. I love being in space with both of you. So thank you for this opportunity. So my name is Kelly Gonzalez. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation in Mexican. And I'm also the mother to Ren and Caleb. And I say that because I root myself in a vision for their future that is, you know, a good future. And I realized that they inspired me to do this good work, to heal, to come from love in my work, to reclaim all of the parts of me. You know, they did that long before they were even born. And they inspire me every day. And I feel fortunate to have them in my life. So I'm connecting with you today from the lands of the Huichol people, where I'm doing self-care in the foothills of Mexico's Sierra Madre mountain range and the Pacific Ocean. And as a guest to these lands, I am healing on these lands. I'm healing so that I can more fully step into the dreams inspired into me by my children, by my ancestors, to keep doing that good work for beautiful today and tomorrow. So I'm honored to be here today with all of you, and I appreciate the good work from the planning committee and the sponsors to create this space of knowledge sharing and healing and understanding, and maybe even some dreaming. Um, so I'll share a little bit. Do you want me to share a little bit about my work now, or do you want me to wait?
Sure, you can go ahead and share that at this time too, and then then we'll hear from Abigail.
Great. So in my professional self, I am an associate professor at the School of Public Health, OHSU, Portland State University School of Public Health. I'm the only tenure track Native person in that program, and I recently received tenure, indefinite tenure and promotion to an associate professor in 2019. And all of my work is rooted in community partnerships. And I try as much as possible to, where my work is driven by community desire, centering on the strengths of community. I'm situated in a white dominant institution, but also in community. And so it's challenging. Some days are harder than others to do that good work. And in terms of the other things I do, I'm a researcher. I'm a PhD trained researcher. My focus is on understanding the ways in which racism impact the health of Native people within the context of healthcare, health interventions, how colonialism plays out and informs health policy, data, and also indifference to uplifting the needs of our futures and Indigenous equity. I'm also a community advocate, and I sit on various boards, including the Governor's Racial Justice Council, and a member of the BIPOC Decolonizing Data Council, and a member of the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women of Portland. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez. Are you ready, Abigail?
Yes, thank you so much. I just feel so honored and privileged to be here amongst some people that I look up to, that I call friends, that I call sisters, that I call support systems. It is such an honor and a privilege to see your faces, to hear your words, and to share this sacred breath with you, even though we are not in the same place. The sacredness of the words that we share, it doesn't matter whether it's virtual or it's in person. We carry the spirits of our ancestors with us. We carry the futures of the next generations and the responsibility to be a good ancestor. So I am in awe of all of you and the work that you do, and the work that you do inspires me to strive to be that good ancestor. I'm Abigail Echohawk. I'm a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma on my father's side, but I was born and raised in the heart of Alaska amongst the Upper Otna Athabascan people, where my mom was adopted by the matriarch of our village, my grandma Katie John, into Mentasta Lake, Alaska. I was raised in rural Alaska amongst strength, resiliency, beauty, compassion, grace, and trauma. All of the legacies that we all exist in as Indigenous peoples, as we look back on the more than 500 years of colonization that have affected how our people live, but will never affect how we breathe, how we are, and how we sit within our communities on our land, that when I step back on my homes in Alaska, I know that land knows my name. I greet you from the lands of the Coast Salish people, the Duwamish people, the Muckleshoot people, the Suquamish people of Seattle, Washington, where I sit in my offices at the Seattle Indian Health Board, where I am able to serve our relatives every single day for one reason only, and that is for the love of Native people. I'm a mom. I have two sons. The youngest is about to graduate high school, so I'm going to be an empty nester. Send me cards. I'm going to need help. And so my sons are the joy of my life. They are the reason that I sing, that I pray, that I wake up in the morning, because I know that I sing, that I pray not only for them, but for their children's children. And so I am also a sibling to 7 siblings who work across Indian country in a variety of different things. And I am also a community member here, not only in my tribal communities in Pawnee, Oklahoma, but also in Alaska, but here in Seattle, in a thriving urban Indian community where we come together in a variety of different ways to support each other and to build forward the resiliency of our communities. And when I think about that resiliency, that's what my work is rooted in. Everything that I do is for the love of Native people, is guided by the elders and the ancestors and the young ones who direct us on that right path. We always say in my family, we don't make any major decisions unless we all come together and pray and have that knowledge together as a community that that is the right next step for us. And so my family has guided me into this position where I currently serve as the Executive Vice President of the Seattle Indian Health Board, which is a federally qualified health center and an Indian healthcare provider in Seattle, Washington. We have an incredible group of Native people, about 65% of our patient population, who we call relatives. 65% of our relatives are American Indian or Alaska Native. 80% are people of color. And that includes what our staff looks like. Right now, our staff is 83% people of color. And that is part of our work towards not only saying equity, but putting it into action. Recognizing that our resiliency isn't a noun, which is what it looks like in the dictionary. It's not a thing. It's an everyday action towards building forward the beauty of our community and reclaiming the culture that they attempted to strip away from us. In that reclamation of culture, I direct the Urban Indian Health Institute, which is one of 12 tribal epidemiology centers located across the United States. You guys have one of the best there in Portland, the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board Tribal Epicenter. Love those folks, work closely with them. The other 11 work with the regional federally recognized tribes, whereas the one I direct is national in scope and recognizes that 71% of us currently live off tribal lands in large urban settings across the United States, and that we weren't very often represented in the data, the evaluation, the research, or the public health efforts to make sure we can build on our strength and resiliencies to overcome the continuing oppression and colonization that has resulted in bad health outcomes and safety outcomes for our community. So I get the privilege of being the director of that group. My work has centered in everything public health, because public health, I always say my parents were the first public health practitioners I ever met. They clothed people, they built tiny homes. We had one guy that lived with us for 9 years that my dad picked up hitchhiking on the side of the road, a Native person. They were public health, and I didn't know that there was a Western word for it. So when I stepped into this role, it's a traditional role. I'm following thousands of generations of public health practitioners and the knowledge and the science of our communities, the thousands of years of science. So I am a storyteller. I'm a storyteller of health. Western science calls me a researcher. Some may call me an epidemiologist, but I know I sit, I breathe, and I live within the stories of our people, whether it be written in numbers or whether it be spoke through their words and their actions. That is who I am, and that is who our organization is. Over the past couple of years, we have really focused it on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. A lot of that initially started with when I came in and started as director. I do identify as a Native woman who was sexually assaulted on Native land and never saw any kind of justice as what is framed as justice as a result of the bureaucracies of the maze of law enforcement that simply did not care about an Indian girl or an Indian woman. And so a lot of my work has been healing myself so I could be a good mom. So at some point I can be a good grandmother. And I experienced in my early years a lot of the things that we talk about our youth. You know, I abused substances. I had very unhealthy behaviors. And it took a lot of healing, and it was only our culture and tradition that was what I needed to move forward. And so we've incorporated the strengths of not only my story, but of my staff stories to build forward our work on missing and murdered Indigenous women, which at this point in time is 4 reports, including one that just came out today, that talks about sexual violence, domestic violence. And we, to this date in 2018, put out the very first and still the only, for some reason, I still want to fix that, the only data report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in 71 cities across the United States. That report has been used to pass more than 30 pieces of legislation in different states across the country. It was used in the advocacy that helped pass Savannah's Act and Not Invisible Act under the last administration. And it is part of what pushed President Biden today to issue a proclamation on remembrance of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I will tell you the difference between what I did here at the Urban Indian Health Institute and what I was able to do in my previous jobs at universities across the US. We don't start and we're not grounded. We are decolonizing data and decolonizing research by going back to who we are. Be who we say we are. Be guided by the elders, be guided by the ancestors, by our stories, by the land, by our connections to the earth, the wind, the four-legged, the two-legged creatures. We supplement with the best of Western science, but it is not what we are grounded in. That report I just talked about, I had no funding for that. I worked on it at night along with my co-author, Anita Lucchese, and I funded that through $20,000 that I was able to earn through speaking fees that I charged to non-Indian organizations and other organizations. That's what funded that work because we couldn't get anybody to care. We're not waiting for them. That's not ancestral tradition. Our traditions is the public health community my parents did. If there was somebody who needed housed, we housed them. If there was somebody who needed fed, we feed them. And if there is somebody experiencing violence, we fight for them. And that is the work that I am blessed to do. And I don't consider it work. I consider it an ancestral calling and tradition. And I also can't wait until those next ones come and take over and I can step back and be their support system. So we build in strong mentorship components of both folks ranging from high school all the way to postdoctoral, so that this work isn't held by one person, by one community, but is held by the entire community of Indigenous peoples, where we then get the support of allies and accomplices to say, justice for our women isn't words, it's a demand, and that is part of our resilience.
Thank you so much, Abigail. You both brought up the concept of love in your comments, and I think that's really important for viewers to understand that a lot of this work is based in healing and love, and it's that love for community that keeps Indigenous people grounded and moving forward. And I know that this isn't easy, and I know you described it as not necessarily work, but it's also like a responsibility, right? Like reclaiming those ancestral connections and responsibilities as Indigenous people, and to take care of each other. And I really love, I love that love came up, but it makes my heart happy to hear you all bring that up so central in what guides you all's work that you do, and thinking about future generations. You both talked a little bit about, or you both practice storytelling with us as well. And that's an area that I'm super interested in, as well as that way that we do storytelling doesn't always look like how people think it does. And one of the things you brought up was the storytelling with data and how that can shape our realities. And I appreciate that coming up. And so I see we have a question in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that one up, and then perhaps we can come back to some questions I wrote down for you all too, if we have time. But I really hope that audience brings your questions as well for our guest today. And it says, the first question is, what area, fields, and Native issues are of most need by Native peoples for allies studying Native studies that could use more help?
I guess I'll start. That's a really great question, and a broad question, in that I would say every area. The areas that I'm most passionate about, one of the things we found in our report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was related to technology, engineering, really focusing on those STEM fields, and the fact that we had databases, and I'll give you an example. There's a database in Fargo, North Dakota, which has a very large urban Indian population, along with having large tribal reservations located around Fargo, North Dakota. It is also the place where the horrific murder of Savannah Graywind occurred. That in Fargo, North Dakota, when an officer would go and get a report on a missing person or on a murdered person like Savannah Graywind and others who have been murdered in that area, that if they didn't ask for race or ethnicity, that database defaulted them to white. And we know officers aren't collecting race and ethnicity. So what happens in that default database is everybody becomes white. And that means we're not able to understand the full scope of what is happening to our people. So what does that mean from a race and social justice perspective? And what does that mean for fields that Native people need good people in? I imagine in my mind, because we look at the statistics on who does data programming, who creates these programs, in my mind, looking at just, you know, we know about that group of people, it was probably all white men sitting in a circle deciding what's going to be programmed. It never crossed their minds that you can't default to white, because implicit bias and the embedded way white supremacy has embedded itself into systems of institutional and structural racism results in data systems that default to white. White is not a default, race is not a default. So I'm always encouraging people to get into those fields. We need people who get understandings of what social justice is, what it means to undo institutional structural racism. We need more women. We need more people of color. We need more LGBTQ plus two-spirited people in these fields. We have to change the way that field looks, the way it operates, so we can be able to start to begin to achieve justice. By making us invisible in the data, they are effectively taking away all of the resources that we have a legal right to through our treaties. I call it the modern day genocide through data genocide. They're eliminating us, and they're eliminating the federal government's treaty and trust responsibility to Indigenous peoples. So that's one field I'm passionate about, but I'm sure Kelly has others. Every field needs more allies and accomplices, but I will also say, make sure Native people are the ones leading.
Thanks, Abigail. That's so powerful to think about data genocide too. That I've been sitting with that the past few months when I first seen you put that statement out there, and it's just, yeah, it's really powerful. Kelly, the question is, what area fields? Oh, hold on. What area fields of Native issues are of most need by Native peoples for allies studying Native studies that could use more help? So like what areas in Native studies couldn't for allies, or what areas in general?
Thanks. Yeah, I got kicked off for a sec, and it might happen again.
Uh-oh.
Just
I think Kelly may be having.
say, oh, am I? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. Well, let me just try without my video for a little bit. So I think one of the things that I try to, so I work in a white dominated institution, a colonial institution, higher education, a university that is rooted in colonial logics, systemic institutionalized oppression, framed to create these ongoing logics and understanding through the curriculum, represented by what's there, what's not there, to uphold that very system that is designed to disempower Indigenous people, and to promote to promote benefit to the institution itself. And, you know, it's important to create space so we can have those conversations and use the names like Abigail has done, referring to data injustices or the lack of Indigenous people in data as genocide, as a contemporary form of genocide. not everybody in positions of power, decision making want to hear those words. They don't want to hear those truths. They're easily to understand, but folks don't necessarily want to hear that. And I would say, as allies, it's important to understand the lasting impacts of colonialism within various spaces of public health and the intersecting institutions like education. And because I know for me in my work, when I'm speaking those words, when I'm speaking those truths, the point of danger for me is when I'm standing in my dignity by using those words, by presenting the data that show the experiences of our communities, our populations, the suffering that we endure within a system that invisibilizes us and isn't equipped or prepared or willing to consider the needs of Indigenous people. So for me, when I'm speaking those truths, my concern is how dangerous is it for me to speak those truths? Will I be invited back to the staff meetings? Will I be invited to participate in research projects? I can absolutely tell you that my professional career has been hindered because of the colonial fragility, the white fragility, and the ignorance that I work within. And none of that is to say people are bad people. It's that the system is designed to keep us invisibilized and erased. So if we can look at the gaps within the system, if we can understand that people of color, people who live every day in systemic oppression and suffer because of it, that we are in these institutions to contribute something important, to offer a knowledge and understanding, a perspective that is not inherently there and embedded within those white dominant institutions. And I think that is a necessary step forward or a building block needed for Indigenous equity. And absolutely, we should be at the table. We should build our own table and invite folks to that. And use the power of our visions, our dreams, understanding the possibilities of all the good things, and how do we do this work in our strengths? How do we do this work? My kids are coming to those institutions, and I want them to be their whole self. I want them to be welcomed as kin, as family, and I want them to be creative in those spaces and not a caretaker within those spaces of white dominance. So I think research is incredibly a powerful tool. Education is a powerful tool that I feel like I'm struggling or challenged or inspired to decolonize and reframe them, repurpose them, those tools to meet the best interests of my community, my people, my children, and our future children. I think that's the final thing I would say is that everybody has healing work to do from the lasting impacts of colonialism, not just Native folks. And I wish that more non-Native folks understood that. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kelly. And just thinking too, the way that how we're talking about these topics, that the statistics and numbers, those are people. Like these are, every single one of those numbers has a story attached to it. That's somebody's life, somebody's relative. It's our relatives that we're talking about. In thinking about the data, not only are people misraced, like Abigail was talking about, but also misgendered often. and not collected in the data accurately. And so there's so much work to do in thinking about people that are in allies and Native studies, like understanding those nuances of Indigenous identity, not just about being Indigenous, but also with gender identity brought into the conversation as well. And the role that that sovereignty plays too, learning more about that. I always talk about like how there's a lot of confusion that can be avoided if people understood like what sovereignty in treaties were and what they are, like what it means, and why a lot of these issues are in place because of those violations to treaties and sovereignty in a legal sense, and also on our bodies. And so they're also interconnected. So I would encourage people to continue to learn as much as you can, and definitely take all of what's being said today. And I know it's a lot to hear and process. So as everybody's talking, continue the questions going. We got 3 in the queue right now. So the next one is, what can non-natives or people like me who are barely native do to support the MMIWG movement?
Well, first, I would start by saying there's, if I heard you correctly, did you say barely native?
Yeah, I was hoping you'd say something about that.
Yeah. First, I would like by saying there's no such thing as barely native. If you are a Native person, you are a Native person. Native people never judge things based on blood quantum. That was a US government way of trying to make us disappear. As Native people, who we are is who we are, connected to our families, to our tribes, to our land, and to our responsibility to the community. You are a Native person. Nobody is barely a Native. And what you are is loved, cared for, with a group of people who want to support you on journeys to discover more about your own cultural heritage, because we do recognize, as a result of colonialism, that that was one of the things that was attempted to be taken away from us. And many folks struggle with knowing who's enough Indian or not Indian enough. And in fact, in my new report, if y'all want to take a look at it, it's on my website, uihi.org. It's called Supporting the Sacred with Sexual Assault Survivors. And the very last page, I actually write myself about, I always wondered, am I enough Indian or Indian enough? And those are questions we should not be asking. That is colonialism, and we want to support everybody in their identities. So welcome, beloved Native person. One of the things that we can do to support is look at what activities are going on locally, contribute locally. I see you're wearing a beautiful t-shirt from my dear friends at Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Girls USA. They're in the Oregon area, in Portland. They do incredible work. I support them whenever I can, and whether it be finances or just sending their executive director and staff a little note telling them how much I love them, how much they mean. Those things matter too. Look locally, and then also look nationally. Call out your members of your state legislature who should be doing more support in terms of research, upholding sovereignty, passing legislation that is useful. Do the same at the congressional level. Right now, today, President Biden issued a proclamation related to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, not because it was on the top of his mind, but because there was the fiercest group of Native women you have ever met in your life who wrote most of it and said, this is what you need to say, and this is what you need to uphold, as somebody who said they would benefit Indian country if they came into office. We have the power. We need to hold that power, exercise that power, and push it forward. Another thing that can do is recognizing, I work a lot, probably too much. 60, 70 hours a week is my norm. On a good week, on a bad week, I work 90 plus hours. I'm not always, I very often don't have the time to go out and be part of the marches. We need people out there. I always say in our communities, some of us, we each hold a role and they knit together to support. So we need those people on the streets. I'll get you the tools to push for the advocacy. I'll be out there sometimes. One of the things I've taught my children is whenever there's somebody missing locally within our communities, it's one of the first things we do is we print out the missing persons posters. We go where the families say to go, and we plaster them everywhere. So there's a variety of different things that you can do. I would suggest connecting to your local MMIW movement. And you guys have some really strong ones there. They will help direct you. They follow their social media, follow the direction of these fierce women, predominantly LGBTQ plus two-spirited people. They're the ones on the ground who are really working and pushing for that justice. And I am just blessed to be able to support them in any way that I can.
Did you have some thoughts too, Kelly?
Sure. I'll add to that. I think that what I would appreciate is when we're the question was, I think about for allies as well. And I think what I always talk to my students about is like, what if public health was framed in a way that already saw Indigenous people from a place of strength and already knew that we have the medicines and the songs and the protocols to sustain and thrive life? What would public health be if those were the frameworks and the orientations? In order to move toward that, I think public health has to do some healing around its, around ideas that Indigenous people need to be saved, that Indigenous people are not already self-determined. We already are. And one of the principles of self-determination is about resisting assimilation and also knowing that Indigenous people, Indigenous knowledge, values, that's what's to guide us into Indigenous equity and the best parts of ourselves and the best parts of our community and a whole strong community. So we have the answers. And I think understanding that is a shift for a lot of people in white dominant systems, and especially those who've been educated in white dominant education systems, including higher ed. So whatever we know is what we take into those systems. And so it might be useful to ask yourself, what is the justice that you're looking for? What is the justice that you're advocating and advancing? Is it life affirming to Indigenous people? Does it end the suffering of Indigenous people? I would say for me, if it didn't hold true to those factors, those attributes, it's not a justice that I want to advance. I don't want to advance white justice. I want to advance Indigenous justice for life-affirming conditions for Indigenous people. And I think that, Indigenous people, we are incredibly generous. We offer so much in our experiences and in our knowledge and values. And we want to help inform those systems in ways that they can heal. We're not going to do the healing work for them. And we also won't allow ourselves to be extracted to address the gaps that the system is incapable of addressing on its own. There's some system level issues and changes that need to be considered, as well as like individual level unlearning and relearning.
Whew, if I could Lulu on a Zoom call, sis, like they would be going right now. That was just pure fire. I just want to like raise my hand and say like, you're 100% correct. And that is the place in the space that we need to move into. And that is the strength that you all have in this community. And I will tell you guys, I lean on this woman for support, along with folks like Julian Joseph and others in your community. The strength of the nation, of not only Indian nations, but this country, lies in what Kelly was just talking about. When we achieve that kind of justice for Native people, it will be achieved for other people.
Thank you both so much. So powerful. And so many things and thoughts and emotions. I think everybody's feeling the positive love that's flowing through you all's words. And I really appreciate you bringing up to Abigail that this isn't just for Indigenous people, like this will benefit all people, right? And so bringing that in And you as well, Kelly. So we got some more questions coming in now. That's great. So let's keep rolling with these, and whichever one of you two wants to take this one first. It says, how can the current abolitionist, as in abolish ICE, police, prisons movement impact either positively or negatively this critical work? Do you want me to say that again? I kind of stumbled the question. Let me say it one more time for everyone's sake. How can the current abolitionists, as in abolish ICE, police, prisons movement impact either positively or negatively this critical work?
So I'll start with a story, if it's okay. I was in Oklahoma City prior to COVID and sat down with some elder Native women who call themselves the Auntie Project. And what they were doing is they were collecting things to send to migrant children who had been, were being held by ICE at the border. So here we have these incredible Indian aunties who were doing everything they could for other Indigenous people and sending those resources. That is who our community is. And when we talk about especially ensuring that those artificial borders that were in government imposed, again, around resources and controlling of the movement, the lives and the ways of being of Indigenous peoples, those are artificial borders. So I think in that sense around ICE, there's a lot of movement in Indian country to recognize that we have a responsibility to our brothers and sisters on the other side of the border, not only on the Mexican border and but also on the Canadian border, which we often don't talk about, but should be talking about. In regards to abolish the police, there is differing opinions on that in Indian country, and I'm going to say Indian country specifically, tribal reservations and villages across the United States, because unfortunately, the way that policing happens in those communities as a result of treaties and laws that define how policing happens on those reservations, those unique laws, what we call a maze of jurisdictions, has actually allowed for predators to come onto reservations and violently assault people and not get prosecuted. It was in the first iteration of VAWA, in the second, it was in 2013 iteration of VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, there's been too many. There was a study that came out that was led by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center and other folks. And what they found was that more than 60% of the cases that had been referred into the Department of Justice for violence, including missing and murdered Indigenous folks, were declined to prosecute by the Department of Justice, not because there wasn't a case, but because of lack of resources. And so we were already operating in a different criminal justice system and policing system that then exists anywhere else in the United States. So there are a lot of the things in the abolish police movement that advocates on tribal reservations are acknowledging don't apply to us in the same way. So what we ask is that people let our communities lead that conversation on what restorative justice looks like, on what policing should look like. And the fact that, you know, and I'll tell a bit of a hard story, and I'm sure everybody who's on here, please take care of your hearts. Recognize we're going to be talking about some very difficult things. If you need to step away, please do so. We care about you in your spirit. I'm sure there are prayer warriors out there right now praying for you, but as we tell these stories, please take that time to step away if you need to. In this story, I was working in a particular state, and they told me the story of a predator who was a serial domestic violence predator. And they would move from reservation to reservation across the state where they brutally assaulted their partners over and over and over again. And when they finally would be, you know, they were never prosecuted because of this maze of jurisdiction, because we cannot prosecute non-Indian people on Indian land on a majority of tribal lands. And as a result of that, this person kept moving reservation to reservation. And by the time he hit the last reservation, the only reason it was the last reservation is because he killed that partner. Exactly what the advocates knew what would happen. But he was able to escape as a result of this maze of jurisdiction that never allowed for his prosecution, despite him being arrested multiple times by tribal police. Those tribes were never allowed to charge him because they weren't legally allowed at that time to charge non-Indians on Indian land. Now, if we look at the arguments that are going on against the Violence Against Women Act, it's passed through the House, it's currently sitting in the Senate. The arguments right now on the Indian provisions are specifically around whether or not we can prosecute non-Indian people on Indian land. And multiple members of the Senate, Congress people have gotten up and said, oh, non-Indian people shouldn't be prosecuted on Indian lands. They shouldn't be in Indian courts. What is happening with that is they're killing us. And so this issue of abolish the police is different in our communities, and it needs to be spoken about differently because of the unique laws that we have as tribal people. And I'm not saying it's not happening, that conversation, it's just happening differently. And so that understanding needs to, and is set within tribes and around tribal sovereignty, because we cannot let this injustice continue. And this maze of jurisdictions and these loopholes have been what predators, including serial murderers and serial abusers and sexual assaulters, all of these folks have been using it as a way to continue to target us, and we refuse to let them use it anymore.
Thank you, Abigail. Kelly, did you have anything you wanted to add in, or do you want to?
I love you so much, Abigail. I love how you're just so full of knowledge. I guess I just want to add that, you know, I appreciate a movement that is asking us to question why abolition would be an answer or needed. Where in our systems need remedy or need to be dismantled, or you know, why are we asking for these kinds of massive changes? I appreciate community coming together in the powerful ways that it does to push against the systems for change, for something different that is beyond the imagination of those systems. Those systems lack the imagination to think of the possibilities of something different, of a different type of a system that really does center in our lives, in the valuing of our lives. So I just want to say that I think it's good to come together and name these tensions, create the spaces where we can name these tensions and understand how the systems are not meeting our needs and killing us, as Abigail is saying.
Yeah, because the underlying systems are the same, right? It's the same system that's inflicting the violence, and it's not a metaphorical killing, it's like literally killing our people. And it's so heartbreaking, the complicity and the role that that lack of jurisdiction, how it's rooted in, basically it's rooted in a white supremacist culture, as in not the people, the system, of saying that Indigenous legal systems, Indigenous ways of justice and restorative justice are not as legitimate, right? That's why the Major Crimes Act was passed in the first place, that led the path of all these violences being created as acceptable. And I think that's a big part of it, is that it's so ingrained in the federal law and policy and normalized as acceptable. And it kind of spills out all over the place, right? It starts on the tribal lands, and it's, as Abigail pointed out with the data reports, it's all over the place. And I think there's that misconception sometimes that it's only on tribal lands, it's everywhere. And the misracing and misgendering has a lot to do with those numbers being a little bit off. And so we know, because we know from people that we know going missing and from being killed, that those numbers are higher than are being reported. And so that's the sad truth. Like, the numbers that we have are what we have to work with, and we cherish those numbers because that's all we have, and that's what we have left to remember people by, to fight for more justice. And so I think that bringing that conversation about rethinking and reimagining, and that is very important piece of this conversation as well. So thanks for your answers and bringing that question in. We have another one. This one has a lead up, so it's kind of a little bit of a long one. So I'll read the thing, and then I'll read the question part of it again, okay? So it says, hello and thank you for this incredible panel. I have many students passionate about this topic. Many want to become a part of the field and the decolonization of data that you speak of, but there aren't many ways they can begin to build a resume that leads to this work. As a community college teacher in Portland, I'd like to know if organizations these students might get involved in, reach out, work for, intern for maybe a list of potential organizations. I'm often asked for resources for Indigenous people, but I'd like to hear from actual Indigenous people about which you think students could become actively involved in. So I think they're asking for recommendations in the Portland area of how to be involved.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for thinking about your students and connecting them to the Native community. And, I guess the first thing I want to say, I have a lot of students. I teach undergrads, and I teach also graduates, but mostly undergrads. And what I tell my students, most of them are non-Native, is that working in Indian country, working with Native in Native communities, Native-led organizations, working towards Native justice, it requires some patience first, students have to understand that, what is their role? I think it's a very different, what I try to tell my students is that it's a responsibility, but it's also an honor to be working for the betterment of Native people. And how can they, as non-Native people, use their privilege to interrupt unsubtle inequities, ignorance, stereotypes, and how and understandings that they may have about what are the root causes for persistent inequities in Indian country. It's important they have a understanding of the role and the roots of colonization. That health for Indigenous people is rooted in colonization. That it's that those disparities are because of the conditions of the inequities and the systemic and institutional oppression that we live within. And that's a whole class in itself. So maybe add some classes first to help students understand that what does Indigenous public health mean and look like, and what does it mean to be in relationship with that as a Native or non-Native person. It's a lifelong commitment. It's not something to just build for your resume. There's a difference when we're talking about deep transformational equity work versus a checkbox approach. We want to make sure that our students are well prepared so that they aren't harming themselves or our communities when they do this good public health work. So I think that's all I'll say about that. I do want to say that as a tenured professor in the OHSU PSU School of Public Health, I've been working with community for the last 3 years to create and implement the Indigenous health concentration for undergraduate public health students. It's a new concentration that is framed in Indigenous knowledge, a decolonizing praxis, and decentering whiteness. It's still being implemented, but that could be a model that could be carried in other institutional spaces, academic spaces. And also I want to, I guess, offer some ideas of groups in Portland. There are many Native serving organizations, thriving Native serving organizations, NAA and NARA, the Northwest Portland Area Health Board, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women of Portland. There's the Future Generations Collaborative, and I often do connect my students with some of that work, and but I don't just plop them in there. I'm with them and mentoring them, and giving them space, also like creating a space where they can talk about and unpack the experiences that they're having, so that they reflect on themselves, like the unlearning that they're doing through that experience. So I would say in that way, that's not, those aren't the kinds of training or preparation often that we see in higher ed for our public health students. So we also have to be mindful about the burden of bringing students who are unprepared to our Native organizations and our other Native serving initiatives. And it's not to say don't do it, it's just, I think the role of relationship is critical when creating these connections and pathways for our students.
Brilliant, as always. We're obviously the Mutual Fan Club. We really like each other. But absolutely brilliant. And I'm going to get a little nerdy because this is, again, my field, and looking at data specifically and decolonizing data. First, I suggest anybody who's not, you start following the work of Dr. Desi Lone Bear Rodriguez and another dear friend of mine, Dr. Stephanie Carroll from University of Arizona. Desi is at UCLA. They founded the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. I do sit as one of the founding board members of that. It's part of sister organizations, and we have one in Australia and one in New Zealand that really looks at using international treaty law as that the United States and then these other countries have signed on to in upholding Indigenous data sovereignty, which is part of decolonizing data. The ability for us to govern, to ensure best practices and all of the things we need to do for the good and well-being of our people is embedded in Indigenous data sovereignty. Also check out some of the work of Dr. Sandra Littletree, which people are always like, did you just give, somebody in library sciences? I'm like, yes. She talks about data specifically in talking about the how we are in relation to it. That is a decolonizing aspect to Indigenous data. So often when people see numbers specifically, you don't feel in relationship to the number. So another hard story related to some work, the very first of our reports in Our Bodies, Our Stories was sexual violence against Native women in the city of Seattle. We talked to almost 150 Native women and found that 94% of them had been sexually assaulted or coerced into sex in their lifetime, much higher than any other race or ethnic group. In that, when we are calculating out that data, there was actually an individual, one of the folks that we had interviewed, who had been sexually assaulted more than 150 different times in her lifetime. Horrific, absolutely horrific. From a data perspective, from a team like mine and others across the country, when you would hand this data set over to somebody teaching epidemiology or statistics, they would say, oh, you got to take that one out. It's what we call an outlier. So even the language we use is dehumanizing when we talk about data. It doesn't, when you say an outlier, you aren't talking about yourself in relationship with that loved one whose experiences are reflected in her stories. So instead, when we talk about that data that we did not include in our analysis, I talk about how I spoke to that person, how I told her how much we loved her. And because we honor and carry her story with us, we honor it in a different way, so we could also respect and honor the stories of the others. She is not an outlier. She is a beloved member of our community, and I am in relation to her. My staff is in relation to her. The report and the statistics that we put out are in relation to her. So Dr. Sandra Littletree has written about what that means from a decolonizing perspective, to be in relationship with data. So that's part of the decolonizing process that we talk about. A lot of these things, again, I'm not recruiting anybody into our cultural or spiritual beliefs. And actually, if you're not Native, I am actively asking you to not try to become part of those, but you can work towards understanding and the understandings of how data has been used as a tool of war against us versus one that is looking towards restoration and healing that Kelly's been talking about. So the work that I do is, I've done it, I think I do 3 or 4 lectures a month, if not more, with biostatistics class, epidemiology classes, all the folks who are learning the methodologies on how you present data. And I'm attempting to get them to relearn that, to come from a strengths-based perspective, to understand where white supremacy is embedded in data systems and the way that we look at information, to begin that decolonizing process. And the folks that I just shared with you, they are my guiding light. They are the ones who are leading the field. They are the ones who are carrying the strength of their ancestors. And I am blessed to be able to look towards them and the knowledge that they bring to help guide our work forward, because we have to change the system in order to undo the harm that it is causing our relatives.
Thank you. And we have lots of questions. I'm going to jump down to one because it's really related to this that we're talking about right now. There's a question that says, how can we fix the data? Is it possible?
Oh, that's actually what I'm working on right now. I'll share with you a project I'm in the middle of. I'm almost done with, actually. I've partnered with one of the largest counties in the country, a law enforcement office, the prosecutor's office, and was because right now what we discovered, again, the embeddedness of white supremacy, the non-collection of data. I actually worked with a law enforcement office who had a box in their database that said observed race. They never asked. They would just visually look at somebody and decide for them, like, this is what exists in law enforcement databases. So they decided everybody was white. Predominantly, everybody was white. And so what we've done is work with this large law enforcement agency. What we found is in their victim data of folks who had been victims of violent crime and who were missing and murdered peoples, that they were missing 58% of all their victim data. So this is one of the top 10 largest counties in the entire country. So we have worked with them, and because of the political will and our relationships with this county, we have actually reformed their data systems on how they collect race and ethnicity of American Indians and Alaska Natives. In 2 weeks, I will train more than 3,000 of their staff on not only how to collect it, but why to collect it, and talk to them about how it impacts MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We will then use that as a national toolkit, which will launch in June with a whole bunch of resources. There's not a county or place in the country that can't fix this problem with this toolkit and political will, which means people pushing law enforcement agencies to do what is right. But one of the things that happened as a result of our reports that was pretty disappointing to me was all these law enforcement agencies saying, yeah, we recognize there's a problem. It can't be fixed. My answer is, oh, yes, it can. I'm going to show you how, and this is not your excuse anymore. It will release at the end of June. We will do a full release of that report, of that toolkit.
Looking forward to reading that one for sure. As a fellow data nerd, you got anything?
My favorite kind of people.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I wanted to just build on what Abigail is talking about, and I'm so excited to see that toolkit as well. You know, like what you just talked about is you went beyond you were using your own tools of discernment and this idea of like something else, another way. And in that action, you didn't accept complacency within the system. Oh, we can't do it. It's just the way it's always been done. So thank you for modeling that, because I think that's really also an important piece to moving forward, advancing the system change that we're looking for, the Indigenous equity that we desire and deserve. Is really building our own tools of discernment to know that, no, people are doing this work and it's effective, impactful, valuable, rigorous. And just because it doesn't exist absolutely is not an indication of its value. It's just that the systems haven't been embedded yet with our perspective and orientation. with our creativity. And when you have, there's other layers, whether it's like publishing your research in a peer-reviewed journal. If you have editors who don't feel comfort yet in like, say, my naming of genocide as a justification for this new model or this new toolkit, they have the power to censor me and prevent my paper from being published and put out into the world. See,
Kelly, you're starting to freeze up again. You still there, Kelly? Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll see when her connection pops back in. There's another question that's kind of thinking about like systematically thinking through things. Oh, there she is. Uh-oh. Kelly, I think there we go. Okay, we will try again with her. There's another question though that has to do with systems and thinking about change that I'd like to pull in since we're on that theme right now. It says, has anyone witnessed examples of alternative forms of justice in relation to holding perpetrators accountable that come from Indigenous communities, whether in the US or north or south of the US borders? Or what forms of justice are families asking for?
Oh, such a beautiful question. This idea of what restorative justice looks like, I've often thought and been with my lawyer attorney, I call them the current day lawyer warriors of our community, is that they've really been pushing towards what restorative justice looks like in our communities. Everything from wellness courts. I can look here at the Tulalip tribes here in Washington, which have done an incredible job, led previously by their Chief Justice, Ron Whitener, and now by Chief Justice Michelle Demerit, in creating these wraparounds of love in the community to help do what we used to do and bring together the elders in the community to help teach our people to get back right on the right path when we maybe get a little bit off center. And I say that as somebody who has done that, who needed to be directed back to the right path. I was one of those people. And so these ideas of restorative justice are happening. A dear friend of mine is working in Alaska right now, where they're building tribal court systems around this idea, where they bring in the person that in another system would be called a perpetrator. But in these systems, they're called a loved one. And we don't throw any of our people away. We love all of our people in all of their hurt, in all of their grief. And we also ensure the safety and the well-being of the community by bringing in the proper tribal protocols. So there's a project like that happening in Alaska across a multitude of different villages, where they're building these restorative systems where when somebody makes a mistake and needs directed on that next path, they sit them down with the community and the community elders, and they make a plan together for their steps forward. So there's incredible things happening right now. Definitely follow there's a tribal court justice, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a bunch of tribal court judges who have their own like affiliated group. They share a lot of things on that website and on those listservs. There's a lot of this work going on where we are going back to our traditional practices of caring for all of our people and all of our mistakes and all of our griefs and all of our traumas and all of our joys and all of our resiliencies, and doing what outside calls restorative justice, but what we call being Indigenous people.
Thanks so much. And that's what that's sometimes viewed as a threat, right? Though, like being able to use those justice models, as you described, as just practicing our ways and being who we are, but it's looked at as not fitting in the confines of existing systems. And that's scary for a lot of folk, but they've been around for thousands of years compared to this justice model that we live in right now that has not been around as long as it has, right? And so thank you for that. Kelly, did you want me to ask the question again, or do you want me to ask the next question?
Go ahead and ask the next one.
Okay.
Can I add just one thing really quickly? You're right. It is threatening when we restore ourselves to that cultural way. That is a threat to white supremacy and colonialism, 100%. In addition, these things are a threat to the prison industrial complex that benefits off of not only the labor of Indigenous and Black folks and other people of color within prisons, but they also benefit from their incarceration. And so it also interrupts the prison industrial complex, which we have to recognize it for what it is. It is not about reform. It is not about justice. It's about labor and it's about money.
Exactly. Thank you for adding that in. I'm going to pull this next question in that kind of goes along with justice, but this one's about climate justice and land back. And so will you speak to the relationship between MMIW, GR, and climate justice / land back movement?
Well, I'll go here. Thanks for your patience as I freeze and lose connection here. So, you know, I think that what comes to my mind, what I want to speak to is any system that is designed to reduce us as not valuable and not to be valued as rapeable as also the land is rapeable in those frameworks. You know, I think that needs to be reconciled and considered in all ways. If we have a system that reduces us as rapeable and the land as rapeable, then how do we find justice in that? How do we find healing in that? Where are the answers in that framework? So I think that's what I wanted to add to this. That's what was coming up for me. I had peeked at the question and answer and saw that question as well.
So I agree completely. And I think about what I'm doing in my office right now. So this is what I've been holding in my hand this whole time. This is my 4th out of 5 MMIW panels I will do today. That's not easy. It weighs on me. By this last one, I thought, how am I going to keep doing it? The one I have at 4 o'clock. And I knew I needed strength, and I knew I needed ancestral strength and connection. And so I got a piece of corn. This is Pawnee corn. It's part of our what was stripped away from us. And I'm in relation to this piece of corn, as it is, this particular one is representative of the women in my community. And it's part of our creation story. The first mother was an ear of corn, and each kernel was the next generations. So this entire time we've been talking, I've been holding on to this piece of corn in my lap because I needed its strength. That is unique to Indigenous peoples. And when we look at our connection to land and the land back movement, I've actually written some poetry about how connected I am to the land. Like I say, when I step on it, it knows my name. I know its name and I know my responsibility to it. And so when we look at rape as a tool of war, and if folks are into kind of looking into human rights scholarship, there's a lot that has been written about rape as a tool of war specifically, and a way to take not only a people, but the resources. And here in the United States, they focused on Native women. Some of the most early documented trafficking, murders, kidnappings are in Columbus's journals. You just got to look at his journals. And he talks about how it's just who they were. When we look at the over-sexualization of Native women, Pocahontas was a 6-year-old who was kidnapped, trafficked, and then died overseas away from her land and away from her people. But yet we see her as a Disney character in a one-armed, over-sexualized way, running around this land. That attempt to break us not only from that, and our bodies as Indigenous women are connected. There are some places where I stand in ceremony, whereas the women, we take off of our shoes because we are the most powerful people there, and our feet have to be connected soul to soil on the land. This extraction of our resources, of the man camps that come in and rape and murder with absolutely nobody doing anything about it. In fact, one of the stories that I was both fortunate to hear and still breaks my heart to this day was of a Native woman who was basically kidnapped into one of these camps, trafficked around and raped multiple times. They dumped her in a ditch outside of a man camp. She manages to hitchhike her way to a local police station where they then arrest her because she had an outstanding warrant for a misdemeanor. She spent 3 days in jail without even getting a rape exam, even though they knew she had been raped. These extractive ways of looking at not only the land as a resource to pillage, not to care for, is the exact same thing that started with the women and then was used as that tool of war to extract resources and to take our land from us. Land back is more than physical. Land back is spiritual, is mental, and is a way for us to think about the restoration of a woman who sits here with you today holding a piece of corn in her hands, because that is the strength of her ancestors. And I know they sit with me today, not only in this corn, but all around me. And so land back is a movement for land back. Feel free, if you are doing your estate planning, to will your land back to the original caretakers. And it's also a movement of reclamation of bodies. And so as a sexual assault survivor, I often think about it because I think land back, skin back, body back. What would that feel like? And how do I ensure that is not an inevitable outcome for my relatives to experience what I did? What the women, I tell you their stories, nobody should ever experience that again. And land back is part of that movement and is part of the restoration of who we are, who we have always been, and who our future is. And that is to live in relationship with this earth, to be caretakers of the earth as it caretakes of us, to ensure the future for the next generations.
Such beautiful, powerful words. Thank you. Did you have anything you wanted to add in, Kelly, with that question? Or do you already answered this one how you went first? And just thinking about that, I'm just like sitting with what you said too as a moderator myself, but just thinking about those connections that you're talking about and that continued extraction and violence, how it's so interconnected, the exploitation of lands, bodies, labor, how you're even linking in the prison industrial complex to that. It's all connected, right? And it's the restoration of those relationships and responsibilities that come with land back that are so central to. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go back up to another question. Oh,
I'd like to actually add something more to this. You know, when I was listening to all that was unfolding, you know, I kept thinking about my own experience when I was writing a recent paper on countering colonial violence through Indigenous values, and it was for an environmental justice journal. And I wrote it in collaboration with Michelle Jacob, who from the Yakama Nation, and others down at University of Oregon in the education program. And you know, we wrote in that paper, like in the first sentence, that colonialism or settler colonialism always reduces Indigenous people as less valuable, as rapeable, and also the land. And, you know, for me, research and writing has always been an access point for my own healing as well. And I cried a lot writing that paper. That was a really challenging paper for me to write. And, you know, in my vulnerability right now, what I want to say is what I was recognizing was the ways that I had internalized white supremacy or the conditioning of white supremacy or the patriarchy in my own body and my mind and my thinking and my heart. That paper made me ask myself, in what ways do I think I'm rapeable? And I know that's a hard thing to hear. It's hard for me to say. I feel some shame around that too. But I needed to bring that up in order to heal that, so that when I'm in spaces doing this work, I'm not held back by the shame of that deep, deep idea that was put upon me. So I wanted just to say that and bring that into the space. You know, there's no way to disconnect. Like, all the work that we do is about ourselves. It's about our communities. It's just so encompassing. You can't just compartmentalize and just, there is a full body, full legacy investment in this work that we're doing. And then I wanted to also just, you were mentioning the strengths, Abigail, that, during the summer with the height of the racial reckoning and the COVID pandemic, the stay-at-home orders, our community here in an urban setting came together and we claimed land in various spaces, whether it was in the back of someone's home that they were fortunate enough to own, or rental, or just, any place, pots on a porch, to then what ended up becoming land that we were able to secure on Savi's Island. And we grew food in response to COVID, and we grew food to take care of our families and our communities, not waiting for the system as we were watching, food insecurity and the trauma of COVID just, happening. And for myself, I did a lot of healing in that work, just having my hands in the ground and putting a seed in the soil, not knowing if it was going to turn into corn, and it did. And it was beautiful. And I grew stronger because of it, and grew stronger in my community. And so I learned about self-worth, and I healed some of that internalized white supremacy from the conditions of living in white supremacy. And so I hope that I'm a stronger leader today because of that. And so I just wanted to share that.
It's powerful. Thank you, Kelly. So this one is around helping advance conversations around Indigenous people. And it's, I think this person is watching from Canada, because it says, what can new Canadians, immigrants of color, contribute towards advancing the conversation around Indigenous people?
Well, I think that there's a multitude of ways to do that, particularly, as we're talking about, and I know we have a lot of folks out here from academia, either teaching or currently in school right now, making sure that there is support for these conversations, and support from an administrative level, if there's any administrators in here, on the truth speaking that Kelly was just talking about. Her and I have experienced similar things. And in fact, we both got censored from using the word genocide in a paper. I'll give an example. So I'm not at a university anymore, but because I direct a tribal epidemiology center, I work in research. I do a lot of publishing in peer-reviewed journals, including the CDC and other journals, again, trying to build forward the science of a decolonial way of looking at public health. So I recently gave the keynote address at the American Association of Suicidology. Kelly and I connected about this. So at this, in 30 minutes, I talked about how data, particularly around suicide rates, is being done incorrectly and doesn't truly reflect our experiences. And in fact, the rates of suicide are much less than what the CDC recently put out, because of the way that they calculated data incorrectly that doesn't represent our population. In that talk, I also gave the example of, in 2019, my team and I were trying to publish a paper again on how to overcome chronic health diseases within our communities by acknowledging racism and colonialism as an underlying factor. And we use the word genocide, and we also use the example of the sterilization of Native women, which is well documented in government office accountability reports and many other things. The CDC would not publish our paper until we took out those references. And in fact, the reviewer put in the notes that it was because it was inflammatory. So when we think about how structural racism is built even into the systems of what we're trying, we're trying to publish this to build forward the science of how to do this right, and they wouldn't even let us publish it. So I gave that example at in Florida just 2 weeks ago at this conference. Within 90 minutes, about 90 minutes of me giving that, the CDC had contacted the CEO of that organization, questioning who had vetted me, why I was speaking about the CDC like that. They never contacted me. They went after the organization to limit the reach that I had achieved through that talk. And 6 years ago, something like that for an academic could kill your career. You wouldn't be invited back. You wouldn't be able to be published. This is the kind of embedded racism in the systems that doesn't allow us to move this forward and recognizing what is truly inhibiting our ability for safety, justice, and wellness for our people. But because of the power and privilege I carry right now, I was able to fight back. And in my mind, I saw the 13 mentees I have right now, who I am always telling challenge the system, but I know it's dangerous. The system doesn't want to be challenged. There was a federal agency after one lone Pawnee woman. They should have known it was a Pawnee woman. I wasn't going to let them take me down. But I had to fight, and luckily have friends in the administration right now. And it resulted this in me having a conversation in person with the director of the new Secretary of Health and Human Services under the Biden administration. That is privilege. 6 years ago, I couldn't have done that. How do we extend these privileges to ensure no other person has to experience this, and that these systems of inequity are not only broken down, we always see broken down, I want to blow them up. You know, they can't exist. How do I ensure the 13 mentees I currently have right now don't experience what I experience in simply stating the truth? Nothing I said was a lie, but they treated it as such. And they also treated me like I wasn't smart enough and I hadn't been vetted properly, not because of my qualifications, but because I was a Native woman. And so these are the barriers that we're all experiencing every single day. The aggressions, I don't call them microaggressions, it's straight out aggression that impacts our own individual mental health. One of the reasons I carry this corn with me, and I have the support of sisters like Kelly and others and community members, is these are the fights we're in. And so when we think about how we need to change academia, how we need to build out more resources, we need to create intentional space for truth telling, whether it be in academia or in community, that also has protection and folks with privilege who are willing to use it and fight for people when they call out injustice. And that's what I had in this instance, is a multitude of warriors with way more privilege than me who made sure that the CDC couldn't get away with what they were doing to me. That is the spaces we need to create. That is the power and privilege that can be part of the assistance from people outside of our community and people within our community to create these intentional spaces, have these conversations, and know they're going to be uncomfortable. Achieving equity, if you're being comfortable in your efforts in doing it, you're probably not doing it right. Equity is not comfortable, but it's not voluntary either. We have to do it. This is what our community needs. And this is the fight we're in. And this is the warriors we need to step forward to the front. And all of the aunties, the grandmas, the support systems around them, we cannot do it without you. So please step into this fight with us.
Wow, that is bananas. But thank you for sharing that really solid example of like how they intervene and help support. Did you have anything you wanted to add into this one, Kelly? And then we'll have time for one more question probably.
Yeah, well, Abigail, the whole time I'm on mute and I'm like, I'm affirming you the whole way. Yes. So I guess what I want to say is, so, you know, I have a PhD in public health and it took a lot to get here. It took a lot to get that degree. And I chose that as my path to uphold my responsibility to my community. I always have thought that I'm in the academic space to contribute something. And what I recognize is that that academic space doesn't necessarily, like it doesn't want that. When I stand in my healed whole self, in my dignity, I am interrupting and disrupting the system. I have been called a disruptor, and I welcome that title, and I'm good with that. Thanks for that title. That's okay with me. You know, I think that you know, I just want to say, like, I had a really hard time in my tenure process, not because I wasn't offering a stellar packet, not because I didn't meet all the marks, I did, but I think that the system wasn't, the folks who were reviewing me weren't quite ready to accept or had the capacity or experience to see what I was putting down on my on paper in my tenure packet. I don't want to go into all the details because they're all just right in line with what Abigail was talking about. And really, it's time to move forward and to acknowledge those injustices, and that yes, these systems are rooted in white supremacy. And what I want to say is that I'm here because of the support of the aunties and the sisters and all of those who wrapped around me and believed in me when maybe I was having a tough day, feeling emotionally thin, having a tough day believing in myself. The community has been completely critical in me doing this work. I think about quitting every day. I also want to say that we're incredibly generous in these spaces. I tell some of my higher ups in the academic space when you're out there and you're speaking, when you're talking about, say, decolonization or decolonizing or equity, name your mentors, name those that taught you these words and these understandings, who helped you to understand these complexities, these truths, these realities that may not be part of their upbringing and their lived experience. Name your mentors. And I say we're generous because I know that when I'm offering that kind of executive coaching, I will still remain in conditions of oppression within the system that I work. And those who I've been generous with, they learn new words, and they can promote those new ideas and those words in spaces, and they will benefit. They will gain the prominence, they will gain the access to wealth, they will gain the new positions. And I will struggle to get there, but I'm generous. I'm generous in my offering. And so I just want to name that. And then the last thing I want to say is that land acknowledgements, it's an important step in the right direction, but it's a time to ask, where are the Indigenous people? How is this institution that is on occupied Indigenous lands contributing to the lives of Indigenous people, not to the demise of Indigenous people? And what is the responsibility that's going to be upheld within a land acknowledgement? And I guess finally, I just want to say that this list of all these challenges that both Abigail and I have been talking about, they are distractions, complete distractions that prevent me from doing the work that I'm supposed to be doing and have been asked to do by my community, which is to uplift and be creative and work with our youth. I don't always want to be in the mode of resistance and fighting against a system. But I welcome that, and I take on that responsibility. I'm going to take on that responsibility until I no longer have to. So that's what I want to add. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to ask this last question, and we'll try to keep it to a few minutes, so we have a couple wrap up things and comments we'd like you all to make as well. But this one I thought was important to think about, or for people to hear about, because it's about the effectiveness of advocacy. And it says, how effective has advocacy been at congressional levels, municipal levels, to reallocate funding in the Western perspective? And that's from Susanna Sandoval, Human Rights Commissioner for the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples. That was part of the question.
So my experience in that is advocacy has absolutely been key. With the passing of Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act, one of the things we saw in the first iteration of Savannah's Act is that a Republican who was retiring, who was overseeing the committee in which that act was in, he just tanked it for no reason, at least for a reason he wouldn't say. Someday I'm gonna go to his house and just like put a whole bunch of signs around about all the women who died in the time that he simply killed that bill for no reason. And it was the advocacy of Native women and Native organizations led by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, tribal leaderships, families on the streets, dressed in red, handprints over their faces, little ones in cradle boards, to however old they were, to the elders being pushed in the wheelchairs, that for the very first time, this country actually saw us. And that was the advocacy. To this day, our tribal leadership right now are working on the passing of VAWA's Act. If we don't have advocacy, we will not get the provisions that are needed for our public health and safety into the Violence Against Women's Act. Advocacy has absolutely been key. And we look at organizations like the Native Organizers Alliance, which train our people on how to do advocacy from a grassroots perspective to be effective. There are organizations out there who are teaching that from a decolonial perspective to push this forward. Advocacy has absolutely been key. I always see myself as the support system to the advocates. I will get them the research, I will get them the data. When I can, I will march with them. When I can, I'll be in the offices, but they're the ones who have made all of this happen. And it is because of their footsteps that those next generations are going to enter a safer world than I did.
Thank you, Abigail. I think what I want to add to that is, mobilizing, like in the Portland area, we have an entire week of activities and community engaged activities where folks can come and learn and start building relationship with the Indigenous community, start asking questions that, what is missing and murdered Indigenous women? What can I do to help advance the ending of violence against Indigenous people? What is my role in that? All of the work that's happening is from Indigenous people and allies. And I'm just so proud to be part of the efforts. And it is a community knitted together community of effort, as Abigail was saying earlier. And it's community members that understand that these conditions are not inevitable. And that is powerful. And I'm proud to be part of a group of humans that know that fully in their heart without question. And I just think, I thank them all for the work that they're doing.
I just want to add really quickly that it takes advocates on the outside, like I talked about, but advocates in the system are just as important. Advocates in academia. And then as I think about Portland, I think about Laura John, who has done incredible work. When we did our first report on MMIWG, the city of Portland never responded to our data request, which was actually out of both federal and state compliance with Freedom of Information Act requests. And Laura worked I actually received a letter from the city apologizing for not getting us the information and talking about their steps forward. And I know that Laura, along with, as an advocate within the organizations of the city of Portland, along with her support system, when she told me this, I was actually she was telling me about moving forward on this. I was at an event that Kelly had invited me to. So I'm standing in front of a group of people and then I start crying because it's to see that kind of advocacy and to see it held by our people. So know that you are just as important in the system as outside of the system. We need advocacy in every point and place.
Thank you so much. And we do have one more kind of question call to action for you all, but as we're transitioning, I think like we just need to take that collective, like breathe this in and like just let it. I know it's emotional. I know I've done talks, and Abigail, you're doing back to backs. I'm sending you all the love and strength to keep on for the next one. But as we think about all that's been said, it's important to remember that we're not just victims of colonization waiting to be saved, right? And we are strong people. We're reclaiming and carrying on our responsibilities, especially as Indigenous women. And it's that commitment and that love that you both talked about earlier that helps keep us going. And so before we just do that wrap up, that closing, what if there's a way for people to do self-care, or that you all do self-care that you want to share? I know you mentioned already one way that you do that, Abigail, and a call to action perhaps that folk can take with them today.
Well, I want to just say that, you know, self-care is a new word for me. It's a word that I started feeling okay around maybe 3 years ago. I used to think it was a very selfish thing. And, you know, that's an area that I needed to unlearn the impacts of the conditions that I had been raised in, right? So I believe deeply in self-care. I think it's an act of love. I think it's something that I want to model to other folks. I know that for me, when I'm feeling a little bit weak in some self-care actions, I remind myself that it makes me feel good when I see those who I love taking care of themselves. I always celebrate that. I never say, oh, you know, anything negative. It inspires me to want to do the same, and it helps me to believe that I'm worthy of it as well, and that it's accessible to me. So I just want to say self-care is critical in this work, and it can come in a variety of ways. Extreme, like what I'm doing right now, which is, you know, I'm out of the country for a few months. And that was big. That was a big step for me. But I'm on the land here, and the land that knows the language of the people, and it's spoken every day, and it's been so good for me. And just sharing my vulnerabilities, my fears, creating a practice of letting go. Often I'm letting go things that are rooted in fear, and I let fear know that maybe at some point you were there to protect me, but I don't need you today. I'm letting you go so that I can bring in something new. And I'll let you know if I need you, fear. You know, I say that. So, and I think that when I'm feeling a little wobbly in my confidence, I reach out to my sisters. I reach out to those who see the best in me when maybe I'm struggling to see the best in myself. Working in white dominant systems is damaging. It's challenging. And I'm happy to have a community of people who are also embracing their own self-care.
I agree 100%. So I'm not going to say more about self-care because you've spoken all the great words. I would also emphasize community care. So it was traditional for us to care about the people within our communities and to recognize that we all held responsibilities that at times we needed support, assistance, and love in order to keep going with those. So today, from my community, I had a former Native intern text me and just tell me how much he cared about me. I received a phone call from my dear friend, Valerie Segrest, who just said, hey, I was thinking about you today. I just want to call and say I love you. And I also received, today's been a great day of community care for me, from my dear friend, E.T.I. Jeffries, who recorded a song. And at the end of it, you can kind of hear the birds in the background. And it was such a gift. Community care is part of self-care, and it's part of our responsibilities to care for each other. I was always taught to practice gratitude, and gratitude to each other, to the gifts of the land, is a traditional practice. Now, Western science is coming to acknowledge that gratitude actually changes the enzymes in your mouth and releases hormones in your brain. All of these things, they should have just asked an Indian, and we would have said, of course, gratitude is something we should practice every day. So that's an active practice for me. And part of that is being in gratitude to the loved ones around me, and in gratitude to the ones who even just today reached out to provide that community care for me, which sometimes that community care is like, hey, Abigail, I noticed you were off just a little bit. Have you been getting rest? That's the words that I occasionally need, that we all need. So also practice community care as part of self-care for everybody.
That's so beautiful. Thank you both. And thanks for reminding everybody too, Kelly, like that we all deserve that. Like, because I think when you do a lot of this kind of deep community-based work, that sometimes you forget about that too, like, because there's so much work to do. And I always like to remember that nobody does it on their own, right? There's been generations that have been passing this kind of work down, and we rely on each other. And when we get tired and need a rest, there's somebody else there too. And so remembering not to feel guilty for taking those little moments of rest and love and care for each other in your communities, and receiving it, like accepting that care, like Abigail's talking about, is so important too. I know when I get calls like that, I'm like, oh yeah, I am stressed out. Thanks for checking on me and naming what I was feeling. So that's those little reminders like that mean a lot. And do you all have any last kind of calls to action as we close out this MMIW, MMIR event? Sorry, I was like thinking that all the acronyms that come along with this one. If you all have any calls to actions that folk can take away as well.
I'll finish what I'm saying to everybody today, and that is, we can not only have conversations about how we die, they have to be conversations about how we live. And so our report today from survivors of sexual violence, where they told us their strengths, their resiliencies, and their needs, is part of the work that I'm doing to ensure that we're talking about how do we undo these colonial aspects and get back to the roots of who we are, bring forward healing. Historical trauma exists, but historical healing is what will overcome all of that as we reach backward to heal the past, to ensure a great future for our next generations. That is who we are. That is who I want to be. And those are the songs I sing for my children's children.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Abigail. I think that what I want to leave us with is something I struggle with sometimes. And my word for the year, a lot of times, I start my year with a word. It's kind of the intention of the work that I'm doing to heal myself through that year. And this year it's patience. And that's a tough one for me. A lot of learning involved in that. And what I want to say is that learning patience in systems change is so critical. I'm training myself to see not just the negative. I'm training myself to bring myself into the contemporary space, so that, and all of our people into the contemporary space from strengths, so that we can contribute to an Indigenous future, and rejecting the frameworks that want to just wrap us around the trauma as if that's the end all be all of who we are. And that's not true. And I look to the evidence of change, and it's slow. It can be slow, but it can also, like I look at Abigail, the report that you all put out just in 2018, and how much has changed since then. And here we are, we have an entire week. We have proclamations happening. We have a lot of change that has happened because of that one action so long ago. So I think that's where I want us to think about when we're looking at change, is that it's not always huge, and it's not always you know, some big indication that yes, we've changed. But it's subtle, it's more subtle than that. And we deserve to be in the future. And that's what we're doing. We're putting ourselves in the contemporary space through decolonizing data, standing up for what we deserve and what our children and our children's children deserve. So I just want to thank you all for being here today. I've really been inspired, and I feel good, even in the intensity and in the heaviness of the topic. And I love you both so much. I think I've said that twice now.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Kelly. Y'all are like super amazing. I love your work, and I'm so thankful to spend this time with you all today, to be able to help engage the conversation with the community and helping folk learn more. Sorry, we don't have time for all the questions, but thank you for bringing your voices as audience into the conversation as well, so we can hear what kind of things you wanted to learn about as well. And thank you again to PCC and all the folk who made this event possible. I've continued to watch the work over the years coming out of PCC in the Portland area, and it's just continues to grow. And that ends our time today. I hope you all get some rest. Big thank you again to our panelists for your energy, your great work in the community, and the love for our people that you continue to hold and uphold. And I think we're supposed to stay on after everybody leaves too, y'all.